3 months. That was the promise. 3 years later, the guns are still speaking. This is not the story of a deadline missed. It is the story of a war that refuses to end because too many interests depend on its survival. A landlocked nation bleeds, villages empty, families scatter, and somewhere beyond its borders, comfort is preserved by distance and silence. War here is not chaos. It is a system. Then comes the rupture. A leader stands before the cameras and says what is usually whispered. This war was never meant to end quickly. Not because the people lacked courage, but because the tools of defense were deliberately withheld. Ammunition counted in scraps, weapons locked away, conditions designed not for victory but for dependency. And when that design was named out loud, the ground shifted. This moment is not about bravado, it is about exposure, about asking who benefits when insecurity becomes permanent, when sovereignty is postponed, when a nation is told to wait while others decide its fate. It is about the line between aid and control, between partnership and obedience. Stay with us. This is more than an interview. It is a fault line in modern African history. Subscribe and follow this story to its roots. If a war can be engineered to endure, what does it truly take to end it? And who must first lose their grip? When the new authorities stepped into power, they did not inherit a war already lost. They inherited a war never properly armed. The public remembered a sentence: 3 months if everything was in place. What was forgotten was the condition attached to it: if everything was in place. That condition would soon prove to be the center of the story. Because when the doors of the armouries were opened, there was almost nothing inside. Less than 100,000 rounds of Kalashnikov ammunition across an entire national army. Barely 100 functional weapons available for deployment. In some units there were more men than rifles. In others, soldiers were sent forward with orders but without tools. This was not a shortage created overnight. It was a legacy. The early days revealed a pattern that went beyond mismanagement. Weapons existed but were not distributed. Supplies had been procured but were locked away. Decisions that should have been logistical were political. An army was kept standing but deliberately kneecapped. War in this form was not meant to be won quickly. It was meant to be sustained. Just enough to justify presence, just enough to invite assistance, just enough to postpone self-reliance. As the new leadership attempted to move fast, resistance appeared where cooperation was expected. Diplomatic pressure followed. Certain foreign actors insisted on conditions that made little sense to a country fighting for its own survival. Support was offered with strings attached. Advice arrived that contradicted urgency. Messages became clear not through what was said, but through what was blocked. Ending the war too quickly was not in everyone's interest. The break came with a decision that altered the balance of power. Foreign military forces that had operated on national soil were asked to leave. In early 2023, the long-standing French Special Forces presence ended, closing a chapter that had defined security cooperation for years. This was not framed as hostility but as necessity. A war of sovereignty could not be fought with borrowed command structures. Whatever followed, it would have to be carried by domestic hands. What followed was the real work. First came re-equipment. The immediate priority was simple. Every soldier needed a weapon. This alone took months of negotiations, procurement under constraints, and payments made without the privileges usually extended to aligned partners. Several powerful states refused to sell arms. Others hesitated. The response was pragmatic. Turn to those willing to transact without political tutelage. It was not ideology, it was survival. Parallel to this came recruitment. Each year between 10,000 and 15,000 new personnel were brought in. This was not expansion for spectacle. It was replacement, reinforcement, and correction. The threat on the ground was evolving, not shrinking. Armed groups adapted. Numbers fluctuated. Mercenaries flowed across porous borders. The battlefield did not pause while reforms were debated. By the second phase, equipment began to arrive visibly. Infantry units were prioritized. Support equipment followed. The process was uneven and incomplete, but it was moving. For the first time in years, soldiers could be issued standard arms without improvisation. Morale rose, not because victory was declared, but because dignity had been restored. A soldier with a weapon understands his mission differently from one sent forward empty-handed. Then came the third phase, the most ambitious of all, manufacturing. Buying weapons was no longer enough. Dependency could not be ended by changing suppliers alone. The goal shifted towards domestic defense production, using local resources, local engineers, and local training. This phase remains unfinished, and some details are still withheld for security reasons. What is clear is the intent: never again be placed in a position where a foreign veto determines national defense. Throughout this transformation, the war itself did not stop. Attacks continued. Civilians continued to flee. Entire communities were displaced, with more than 2 million people forced from their homes over the course of the conflict. This reality sat in tension with the rhetoric of rebuilding. Critics pointed to the persistence of violence as proof of failure. Supporters pointed to the starting point as proof of progress. Both were looking at different segments of the same road. At its core, this phase was not about speed. It was about reversing a design. A country that had been treated as a battlefield without being allowed to become an army was attempting, piece by piece, to reclaim control of its own defense. Soil that had been stripped was being replanted. The harvest was not immediate, but the seed was no longer chouche. Yet as the internal rebuilding gathered pace, another pressure began to rise, one that did not come from the bush or the borders, but from the wider map closing in. And if the foundations of sovereignty were finally being laid at home, who was preparing to challenge them from abroad? The turning point did not arrive with a single battle. It arrived with a sentence that redefined the war itself. What was unfolding, the leadership argued, was not merely an insurgency. It was a conflict with an architecture. Violence did not spread randomly. It followed incentives. Routes of arms, flows of money, and diplomatic ambiguities converged into a pattern that rewarded instability. In closed meetings and open interviews, the claim was laid bare. Insecurity had become profitable to those far from the front lines. The longer the war dragged on, the more leverage it created. And leverage, once established, rarely lets go willingly. This assertion provoked immediate reactions. Domestically, it resonated with a population that had watched years pass without decisive change. Many had seen soldiers rotate without reinforcement, operations announced without resolution, and promises repeated without tools. The idea that the war was being deliberately maintained did not sound abstract. It sounded familiar. It explained the shortages, the delays, and the constant sense of running in place. Internationally, the response was colder. Diplomats rejected the framing. Some dismissed it as rhetoric born of frustration. Others warned of isolation, of consequences that would follow if cooperation was redefined on unilateral terms. Yet behind official statements, pressure mounted in quieter ways. Arms deals stalled. Financial channels tightened. Advisory language shifted from partnership to caution. The message was consistent. Deviation carried a cost. Inside the country, the climax took a different form: discipline. The rebuilding of the army was accompanied by a hard internal reckoning. Commanders who failed missions were dismissed. Some were prosecuted. The logic was unforgiving. The mission was sacred, and failure could no longer be absorbed by excuses. This approach unsettled entrenched hierarchies but clarified expectations. Authority would no longer shield incompetence. Responsibility would no longer be diluted by precedent. For soldiers on the ground, this shift mattered as much as new equipment. Morale is not sustained by speeches alone. It is sustained by belief in purpose. Units began to operate with clearer chains of command and stricter accountability. Training emphasized not only tactics but understanding. Why the fight existed, who benefited from its prolongation, and what defeat would mean beyond territory. The war was reframed as a struggle for independence rather than containment. At the same time, the threat evolved. Armed groups adapted their methods, exploiting displacement, porous borders, and local grievances. Numbers fluctuated as new recruits and mercenaries entered the theater. Each tactical gain produced a counter-move. This was not a linear escalation. It was a spiral. The state responded by diversifying operations, combining conventional patrols with intelligence-led actions and community mobilization. Progress was uneven, losses continued, but the sense of paralysis began to lift. Public communication played a crucial role in this phase. Rather than retreating from scrutiny, the leadership leaned into explanation. Interviews became forums for justification and warning. The population was told plainly that the war would not end on borrowed timelines. It would end when the prerequisites of sovereignty were secured. Fear was addressed not by denial but by context. Coup attempts in the previous year underscored the risks of visibility. Yet they also reinforced a narrative of resolve. Hesitation would invite compromise, and compromise would undo everything. The reactions extended beyond borders into memory. Historical references surfaced repeatedly. Leaders removed when their paths diverged from external interests. Revolutions neutralized from within. These were not invoked as prophecy, but as instruction. Anticipation replaced improvisation. Security was no longer framed as a personal shield around the head of state, but as a collective posture embedded in institutions, behavior, and vigilance. Critics countered that such framing risked narrowing space for dissent and media independence. Supporters replied that survival demanded prioritization. The debate itself became part of the war's terrain: information, perception, legitimacy. Headlines abroad contrasted sharply with narratives at home. What one press described as pressure against authority, another described as routine mobilization. Language, it seemed, had become another weapon. Amid this clash of interpretations, one element stood out: determination. Asked whether fear played a role, the answer was unequivocal. Fear led to hesitation. Hesitation led to compromise. Compromise led to defeat. This logic, repeated and reinforced, became the emotional peak of the moment. Not triumphalism, but defiance. Not certainty, but commitment. Yet as the internal front hardened and rhetoric sharpened, the strategic environment continued to shift. Borders grew more sensitive. Alliances reconfigured. Meetings took place without familiar participants. The war was no longer confined to villages and forests. It had expanded into councils, corridors, and capitals. And as resolve solidified at home, how would the tightening circle beyond the borders respond to a country that refused to play its assigned role? War does not end at the front line. It settles into kitchens, classrooms, and empty courtyards where voices used to gather. As the conflict dragged on, its most enduring mark was not territorial loss or tactical stalemate, but displacement. More than 2 million people were forced from their homes, not by a single catastrophe, but by the accumulation of fear. Villages emptied in waves. Fields were abandoned mid-season. Markets thinned, then vanished. The soil remained, but the hands that worked it were scattered. This displacement reshaped daily life in ways statistics struggled to capture. Families that once relied on harvest cycles became dependent on irregular assistance. Children moved between temporary shelters and overcrowded towns, their education fractured by movement. Social bonds, traditionally reinforced through proximity and ritual, were stretched across distance. The war created not only victims of violence, but communities suspended in waiting. Waiting to return, waiting to rebuild, waiting to be counted. Politically, this pressure demanded choices. The state could not afford the luxury of gradualism. Emergency measures became routine. Security considerations began to outweigh procedural comfort. Critics described this as contraction. Supporters described it as consolidation. What was undeniable was that the political center tightened. Decision-making accelerated. Tolerance for ambiguity narrowed. In a context where hesitation carried lethal cost, decisiveness was reframed as responsibility. Within the armed forces, this translated into a culture of accountability unprecedented in recent memory. Failure was no longer absorbed by the system. It was confronted. Unit leaders who did not meet objectives were removed. Some faced prosecution. This approach sent a clear signal downward and outward. Authority was conditional on performance. The effect was polarizing. It alienated those accustomed to insulation. It energized those who had long felt exposed without recourse. The social contract shifted accordingly. Citizens were no longer addressed solely as beneficiaries of protection, but as participants in a collective defense. Vigilance became a civic expectation. Behavior, movement, and communication were increasingly framed as security issues. This was not without tension. Lines between caution and constraint blurred. Media organizations found themselves navigating an environment where information was weighed not only for accuracy, but for potential impact on cohesion and morale. The leadership argued that this recalibration was unavoidable. A country fighting for survival could not afford internal sabotage, whether intentional or inadvertent. The past offered warnings. Revolutions undone not by external invasion, but by fractures exploited from within. The lesson drawn was stark. Sovereignty required discipline, not only in ranks but in narratives. At the same time, the civilian toll demanded acknowledgement. Losses mounted. Entire regions endured cycles of attack and counterattack. Armed groups exploited displacement to recruit, intimidate, and extract. Retaliatory violence risked entrenching grievance. The war, while reframed as a struggle for independence, continued to generate human cost that no rhetoric could erase. This tension, between strategic resolve and lived suffering, became the central contradiction of the moment. Economically, the effects rippled outward. Agriculture faltered in contested zones. Transport corridors became unreliable. Informal economies swelled as formal structures weakened. Yet amid contraction, new priorities emerged. Resources were redirected towards self-sufficiency in defense and logistics. The idea that value must be created locally gained urgency. Dependency, once tolerated as a transitional inconvenience, was recast as vulnerability. Public discourse reflected this recalibration. Speeches emphasized dignity over comfort, endurance over immediacy. The war was no longer presented as an aberration to be managed, but as a crucible shaping a different political order. Within this framing, leadership was personalized, but the burden was distributed. The message was consistent. Survival would not be outsourced. It is within this context that the role of Ibrahim Traoré crystallized, not as a singular savior, but as the embodiment of a broader wager. That a nation under siege could choose consolidation over concession. That authority exercised firmly could still claim legitimacy if aligned with a promise of eventual autonomy. Whether this wager succeeds remains unresolved. What is clear is that it has altered expectations, narrowed options, and redefined what politics looks like under sustained pressure. Before moving forward, one question lingers, inviting reflection rather than certainty. Can a society preserve cohesion and conscience while redefining security as a shared, uncompromising duty? As internal consequences continued to unfold, attention increasingly shifted outward, towards alliances forming, borders hardening, and the international arena responding to a state determined to rewrite the terms of engagement. And when domestic resolve collides with global interests, which force ultimately bends? As the internal front hardened, the external landscape began to shift. What had once been framed as a domestic security crisis was now read abroad as a geopolitical signal. Decisions taken at home reverberated through regional blocs, diplomatic corridors, and strategic assessments far beyond the Sahel. The war had acquired an audience, and not all of it was sympathetic. At the center of this recalibration stood the Alliance of Sahel States. What began as a mutual defense pact evolved into a confederation, deliberately distinct from a federation. The distinction mattered. It signaled coordination without surrender, solidarity without absorption. Each member retained sovereign discretion while committing to collective security. This structure unsettled established regional norms, particularly those shaped by ECOWAS, where security cooperation had long been intertwined with external partnerships and inherited frameworks. Reactions across West Africa reflected this unease. Some neighboring governments reinforced borders and expanded cooperation with foreign militaries, citing stability. Others adopted a cautious neutrality, unwilling to choose sides openly. The result was a tightening perimeter, an environment where movement, training, and intelligence became increasingly politicized. Encirclement was not declared, it was inferred through patterns. Beyond the region, attention focused on how non-African powers interpreted this shift. In Washington, official language emphasized restraint and demilitarization, often framed as concern for governance and human rights. Yet such language carried an implicit assumption that security should remain externally mediated. Travel and visa restrictions followed, reshaping diplomatic engagement into a series of administrative signals. Cooperation was not severed, but it was recalibrated, cooler, conditional, cautious. From the perspective of the Sahelian leadership, these measures were not isolated. They were read as part of a broader pressure architecture, one that operates through access rather than force. Restrictions on movement, training, and finance functioned as reminders of who controlled the gates of legitimacy. The response was neither capitulation nor rupture, but redirection. Engagement would continue, but not at the cost of strategic autonomy. European reactions were similarly layered. Public statements stressed concern over instability and humanitarian impact. Media narratives frequently centered on displacement and risk, often detaching these outcomes from the historical scaffolding that produced them. The contrast between how protests or mobilizations were described in European capitals and how similar events were framed in West Africa did not go unnoticed. Language once again became a boundary. In this environment, Burkina Faso emerged less as an isolated case than as a test. Could a state under sustained pressure recalibrate its alliances without collapsing into isolation? Could it resist the gravitational pull of established security orders while avoiding the vacuum that follows disengagement? The answers remained uncertain, but the attempt itself altered calculations. What unsettled external observers most was not the rhetoric, but the refusal to revert. The message was consistent. Cooperation was welcome, tutelage was not. Trade would be preferred over aid, partnership over pity. The implication was clear. Relationships would be renegotiated on different terms, or not at all. As alliances adjusted and diplomatic signals accumulated, the war entered a new phase, one where the battlefield extended into conference rooms and policy papers, and where sovereignty was contested not only with weapons, but with visas, narratives, and access. And if the world insists on setting the terms of engagement, what happens when a small nation decides to write its own? The road forward is neither straight nor guaranteed. It bends under pressure, narrows at moments of doubt, and widens only when discipline holds. What lies ahead is not a promise of quick peace, but a set of choices that will determine whether endurance becomes transformation or exhaustion. The first path is risk. Prolonged conflict carries its own gravity. Isolation can deepen if diplomatic channels calcify into suspicion. Economic strain may intensify as security demands continue to divert resources from social recovery. Armed groups adapt relentlessly, feeding on displacement and grievance. In this scenario, the war becomes generational, and sovereignty remains aspirational rather than realized. The second path is opportunity. If domestic defense production matures, the balance shifts from dependence to capability. Local value creation, processing resources rather than exporting them raw, begins to align security with economic dignity. Trade replaces aid not as a slogan, but as infrastructure, contracts, corridors, skills. The army becomes not only a shield, but a training ground for discipline and technical competence that spills into civilian life. This path is slower, but it compounds. The third path is the hinge. It rests on cohesion. A society under strain must decide how much disagreement it can hold without fracture. Security-first governance demands trust that authority will not calcify into permanence. Media, civil society and institutions must renegotiate their roles without abandoning scrutiny. The wager is delicate. That firmness today does not foreclose plurality tomorrow. Across all paths, one principle repeats: ownership. Decisions made locally carry consequences locally. There is no external guarantor waiting to absorb failure. This reality sharpens responsibility. It also clarifies purpose. When a nation accepts that no one else will fight its battles, it redefines what victory means. Victory becomes less about the absence of violence and more about the presence of agency. The metaphors that guide this moment are simple. Soil must be reclaimed before it can be planted. Seeds must be protected before they can grow. Roads must be built before bridges can carry weight. None of these are glamorous tasks. All of them require patience, and all of them reject shortcuts that lead back to dependence. The coming years will test whether resilience can be institutionalized rather than improvised, whether recruitment turns into professionalism, whether manufacturing scales into sustainability, whether alliances remain tools rather than crutches. These tests will not be passed by rhetoric alone. They will be passed, or failed, in workshops, barracks, classrooms, and markets. The broader implication extends beyond one country. If a small landlocked nation under siege can insist on dignity over convenience, it challenges assumptions embedded across the continent. It asks whether sovereignty must always be deferred until conditions are perfect, or whether it can be forged under pressure. What emerges next will not look like a clean ending. It will look like continuity with intent. Like choosing to stand, even when standing costs. Like refusing to wait for permission to define the future. And as this road stretches forward, the final question is no longer whether the war can end, but whether the choice to own the journey can inspire others to walk it too. This story does not end with a declaration of victory, because victory was never the headline. What stands before us is something quieter, heavier, and far more consequential. A choice. A choice to name a war for what it is. A choice to reclaim tools once denied. A choice to stand upright when bending would have been easier. Across months of rebuilding and years of pressure, one truth has emerged with clarity. Sovereignty is not granted by goodwill, nor sustained by applause. It is built through friction, through decisions that narrow options before they expand them, through patience that resists shortcuts, through dignity that refuses to be priced. The path described here is not heroic by design, it is demanding by necessity. For many watching from afar, the temptation is to reduce this journey to personalities, slogans, or alignments. Yet the deeper current runs beneath the surface. It is about whether a nation can move from being managed to managing itself, whether dependence can be unlearned without chaos, whether partnership can replace pity without resentment. These are not abstract questions. They are lived daily in camps, workshops, and training grounds. The leadership wager has been explicit. That firmness now can preserve freedom later. That accountability can coexist with hope. That rebuilding capacity, military, economic, institutional, is the only credible exit from a war designed to endure. In this framing, Ibrahim Traoré is less a destination than a signal, a marker of a broader insistence that waiting is no longer acceptable. The measure of this insistence will not be found in speeches, but in continuity, whether structures outlast moments. For Burkina Faso, the stakes are immediate and human. Families displaced, fields left fallow, youth asked to choose between flight and resolve. And yet, within this strain, something has shifted. The language of inevitability has weakened. The idea that the future must be outsourced has lost its grip. Agency, once deferred, is being rehearsed. None of this guarantees success. Roads can wash away, harvests can fail, pressure can harden into isolation if vigilance slips. But there is a difference between uncertainty faced standing and uncertainty faced kneeling. That difference is the axis on which this chapter turns. As the dust settles and the arguments continue, one question remains for all who are watching, not as spectators but as witnesses. If dignity can be chosen under siege, what else has been postponed simply because it was difficult? If this story speaks to you, do not let it fade into the noise. Share it, reflect on it, and stay with us, because the choices made here may shape more than one future. The journey ahead is unfinished, but it is owned. And that may be the most revolutionary act of all. One that Ibrahim Traoré insists cannot wait for permission, only for resolve.